They thought humans were weak, that we couldn't survive in a galaxy of monsters, strategists, and warlords. They laughed when we sent a translator. They didn't know that a single human's words could outmaneuver fleets, topple empires, and make the deadliest species in the universe rethink everything they believed about strength. But how did one human do it? That's what the galaxy is still trying to figure out. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story proves one simple truth. In a galaxy obsessed with firepower, humans have a weapon no one expects: their mind. This is the story of how one translator, armed with nothing but words, walked into the most dangerous council in the universe and turned diplomacy into humanity's deadliest advantage. I wasn't supposed to be here. My instructions were clear: translate, observe, and stay out of the decisions. Nothing more. Earth's delegation had sent me as a translator, a bridge between languages, a footnote in the galaxy's history. But the Galactic Council doesn't care about instructions. Not when the room is filled with hundreds of the most dangerous species in known space. The chamber was colossal, impossibly vast. Its walls shimmered with living bio-holograms, panels that displayed entire star systems, fleets, and economic graphs. The air vibrated with alien pheromones and low-frequency sounds humans weren't meant to hear. Multi-limbed beings hovered in psychic fields, their translucent bodies pulsing with energy. Giants walked with power suits that could crush a city. Some floated in zero-gravity bubbles of liquid that shimmered with light. All of them stared at Earth's small delegation like a swarm of predators eyeing a rabbit. And then chaos erupted. Voices collided. Words with the weight of nuclear commands filled the chamber. Threats bounced off the walls like kinetic energy. Each faction wanted supremacy. Each demanded advantage. There were threats to obliterate planets, warnings of fleets that could vaporize systems, and claims of control over resources no one else had even mapped. The room vibrated with tension so thick it was almost tactile. I sat quietly, a translator pod hovering next to me, recording every nuance, every subtle inflection. My hands were steady, but my mind raced. Then it happened. The Supreme General of the Frazilith Empire, towering, 3 meters of muscle and exoskeleton, antennae thrumming with aggression, turned to me. "Human," it hissed, voice like metal grinding against stone, "you will speak. Decide the price." The chamber froze. Every eye, every sensory organ, every psychic projection focused on me. Silence stretched for long seconds, each moment heavier than the last. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but I could not hesitate. The entire galaxy was waiting for a single human voice. And in that moment I realized, humans don't need weapons. Not yet. We have something far more dangerous: logic, ingenuity, unpredictability, and the audacity to survive. I inhaled, and the first words came out, carefully measured. Not threats, not pleas. Questions. Questions designed to unsettle, to probe, to expose weaknesses without raising a laser. What do we truly gain by attacking each other today? The effect was immediate. Aliens froze mid-sentence. Some scoffed, some twitched, others leaned forward, curious. They were used to displays of force, of raw power, of bluster. They were not used to humans using intellect as a weapon, and that was our advantage. The moment my words left my lips, the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a twitch of antennae, a ripple across psychic fields, the faintest pause in a multi-limbed general's stance. But humans noticed the details, the cracks in armor, the hesitation in a supposedly invincible species. "Resources," hissed one. "Power," growled another. "Control," added a third, voice layered with arrogance and certainty, and I smiled inwardly because certainty is fragile, especially when challenged by something they cannot calculate. I leaned forward just slightly, careful not to appear threatening. "And what if I told you there is a way for all of you to gain more without spilling a single drop of blood?" A ripple of shock spread. Some laughed, thinking it a naive human attempt. Others narrowed eyes, curious. One species, the crystalline thrill, shifted in its levitation field, multiple crystalline facets rotating in intrigue. I noticed them immediately. They were not the type to act on impulse. They would observe first, then react. The AI translation pod worked flawlessly, converting nuances of my human tone into forms even the most alien minds could interpret, without diminishing the subtleties of persuasion. Every pause, every emphasis, every carefully chosen word became a tool. Minutes stretched into an hour, but it felt like seconds. Every question I asked, every slight observation I made created ripples of doubt. Delegates who had stormed in ready to command and dominate now glanced at each other, reconsidering alliances, second-guessing threats, and measuring their own arrogance against the human they had thought inconsequential. A delegation from the outer rim, normally the most aggressive, exchanged a glance with their rival and muttered in their native tongue, unsure whether to trust their own judgment. I had not said much. I had only asked questions, framed observations, and hinted at consequences. Yet it was enough. The Frazilith general, towering and lethal, thumped a massive claw against the council floor. Sparks danced along the surface. Enough! This human's words twist our minds. How can one species so small wield such influence? That was the moment I realized. Humans are dangerous precisely because we are underestimated. Every species here had ignored us, written us off. But a mind untethered by tradition, unafraid to question, and armed with insight could become more lethal than any fleet or weapon. As the first session ended, whispers traveled through the chamber. The human, they are different. They think in layers we cannot anticipate. I sat back, careful to appear neutral, yet every nerve in my body hummed. The council had not seen the last of this human, not by a long shot, because humans don't need weapons. And if the galaxy thought words were harmless, they were about to learn just how dangerous diplomacy could be when wielded by the right mind. The council reconvened the next day, and I could feel the difference immediately. The aliens were no longer casual in their postures or dismissive in their tones. Even the largest warlords, beings who had commanded fleets capable of obliterating planets, looked uneasy when my eyes met theirs. Humans had introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty terrifies species built on precision and power. I started subtly, threading provocations into observations, turning their own statements against them without ever directly accusing. I notice, I began, voice steady, that some fleets have overlapping patrol sectors. If a confrontation occurs, which faction truly benefits, and which merely loses face? A ripple of tension spread. The Frazilith general's antennae twitched sharply, a sign I had touched a nerve. You question our strategy? It growled, though carefully measured, as though fighting impulse with protocol. I didn't need to answer. The council's own murmurs filled the gap. Delegates exchanged glances, whispering in tongues none of the others fully understood. Doubt had begun to creep in, unnoticed and insidious. Humans understood doubt as a weapon, a seed planted, nurtured, then allowed to grow until it controlled entire decisions. I observed the patterns, the responses, the subtle tells. A raised ridge of exoskeletons signaling impatience, a glow shift in bioluminescent skin indicating agitation, a ripple in levitation fields showing suppressed psychic aggression. Each was a window, a vector to influence without firing a single shot. Then came the first real test. A faction attempted to bully another, projecting hollow fleets over their opponent's territories. They expected submission, intimidation. Instead, I intervened, not with aggression, but with reasoning. I highlighted the potential consequences of escalation, the vulnerabilities exposed, and the benefits of compromise. I framed it as neutral logic, a human analysis, not a challenge. The bullying faction hesitated. For the first time, they doubted the certainty of their dominance. Even the most confident warlords paused, realizing that humans had disrupted the expected flow of control. Whispers began to circulate. Humans. They are unpredictable. They see connections we do not. By the end of the day, factions were no longer acting purely on instinct or aggression. They were questioning themselves, consulting with rivals, calculating moves in a council they thought they controlled. One alien, the crystalline Thrill, leaned forward in curiosity rather than suspicion. Another muttered to its aide, confused, "This human. I do not understand, and yet I feel compelled to listen." Humans thrive in chaos, not because we are chaotic, but because we structure chaos with ingenuity. While the galaxy relied on brute force and tradition, we relied on thought, adaptability, and audacity. And that was the beginning of a revolution in negotiation. An invisible, unstoppable force that no fleet, no weapon, and no empire had anticipated. By the fourth day, it was no longer subtle. The room that had once crackled with confident threats now hummed with uncertainty, the atmosphere taut like a coiled spring. Every alien present was calculating, questioning, double-checking, and, most importantly, listening. I had begun to map the council like a grand chessboard. Every delegate had motivations, hidden agendas, weaknesses, and ego vulnerabilities. My questions were calculated probes, each observation a potential lever. I wasn't manipulating. I was revealing truths they had ignored. And in that revelation, the power shifted, quietly, almost invisibly, toward humans. "Consider the border dispute," I said, voice steady, careful to mask the subtle edge of challenge. "If one faction expands too aggressively, how does it destabilize trade across sectors you depend on? And what if this destabilization forces smaller allies to defect?" The aliens paused. Murmurs circulated. The Thrill, normally stoic, tilted slightly, facets catching light, signaling cognitive engagement. The Frazilith general bristled, struggling to maintain composure as doubt crept into its ranks. I didn't speak of victories. I didn't threaten fleets. I didn't even promise protection. I only framed scenarios, rational, logical, undeniable, and let their pride and instinct work against them. A single suggestion of risk, a hypothetical analysis, and suddenly, the entire council reconsidered the aggressive moves they had planned. In the hallways outside the main chamber, whispers spread. Delegates spoke to their aides in hushed tones. Earth's human. They twist the conversation without pressure, without force. How is this possible? I moved carefully, observing subtle feedback. A winged diplomat tapped nervously, its bioluminescent patterns flickering in irregular sequences. A multi-limbed tactician shifted stance, signaling unease. I cataloged everything, noting which species were most susceptible to subtle psychological nudges. Humans had always thrived on observation, watching behavior, reading micro-reactions, and applying influence in precise increments. By the end of the session, factions that had been openly hostile were cautiously negotiating among themselves, guided not by threats, but by their own fear of miscalculation. Humans, so small, so underestimated, had quietly reshaped the balance of power. It was intoxicating, not because of authority, not because of fear, but because humans had discovered a weapon no one else understood, a weapon invisible to fleets, shields, and weapons systems alike. One human mind could topple certainty, bend strategy, and redirect ambition. And as I left the chamber for a brief respite, I knew the Council had never faced a force like this. Not missiles, not fleets, not energy beams, just a human, armed with thought, insight, and relentless audacity. The next morning, the Council reconvened. But it was not the same chamber as before. Energy buzzed differently, tense, uncertain, a current of doubt running through every species present. Humans had changed the rules without firing a shot, and now the galaxy's most powerful warlords were scrambling to understand how. I entered quietly, translator pod hovering at my side, but every eye tracked me. A simple human gesture, a nod, a pause, a slight tilt of my head, was dissected, analyzed, and overinterpreted. The small, underestimated species had become the axis around which the council now spun. I began my moves by introducing subtle hypotheticals, small enough to seem innocuous, but designed to shift power balances. Suppose a faction withdraws resources from one system to another, I suggested, and another faction responds preemptively. Who truly gains, and who risks destabilizing its own holdings? The room froze. Some aliens whispered frantically to aides. Others frowned, calculating, questioning, reconsidering decisions they had thought absolute. One species, the sleek and predatory Krath, tilted its head, antennae flicking in irritation. They were used to intimidation, not logic layered like a puzzle. Then came the first overt test. An alliance attempted to bully a smaller faction using fleet projections. The holographic ships of war filled the chamber's main display, bristling with destructive power. The aggressors expected submission, fear, compliance. I intervened, not with threats, not with force, but with a series of questions and strategic observations that forced them to calculate risk. If you act now, can you guarantee your ally will remain loyal? What if preemptive strikes force others to switch sides? Have you considered the economic fallout? The aggressors hesitated. For the first time, their certainty wavered. They were not used to thinking in layers, in contingencies, in long-term consequences orchestrated by an unseen hand. Humans thrived in this space, the unpredictable interplay of logic, psychology, and strategic patience. By midday, minor alliances had begun negotiating secretly, drafting compromises and conditions to avoid escalation. Alien commanders whispered to aides, mistrustful of one another yet desperate to understand the human influence. Even the Frazilith general, once bristling with dominance, tapped its claws against the floor, antennae quivering. "This human," it muttered, voice low, "they do not wield weapons, and yet they bend our decisions. How?" The answer was simple. We don't need weapons. We wield understanding, anticipation, and audacity. By the session's end, the council was fractured, not by battle, not by destruction, but by carefully crafted uncertainty. And as I left the chamber, my mind already calculated the next steps. I realized humans had begun something that no species had ever faced, a war fought with words, logic, and strategy, and we were winning. By the sixth day, the chamber of the Galactic Council was no longer a place of predictable dominance. Aliens who had once believed in intimidation and brute force now approached each other with caution, suspicion, and hesitation. Every gesture, every phrase, every glance was measured, calculated, questioned. And at the center of this storm sat a single human, the translator who wasn't supposed to speak. I had begun to map not only personalities but also networks of influence. Some species relied on alliances that were fragile, held together by fear rather than loyalty. Others were rigid, traditional, predictable. And humans? We thrived on connecting dots others didn't even see existed. Consider the recent trade fluctuations, I suggested during the morning session, eyes scanning the room. Faction A's maneuver in the Helix sector may provoke retaliation from Faction B. Yet if both act on impulse, Faction C could gain disproportionate influence. Who truly benefits? The murmurs began immediately. Delegates whispered to aides, nervously checking sensors and communication links. A few even consulted secretly with rival factions, unsure whether their own intelligence networks were being manipulated. They were, and the invisible hand doing it was human. The Frazilith general's massive claws thumped against the floor in frustration. How does one species, so insignificant, predict outcomes across the galaxy? I smiled subtly. The answer was simple. Humans do not follow convention. We do not rely solely on force, tradition, or sheer numbers. We exploit patterns, anticipate reactions, and create outcomes by turning expectations upside down. By mid-session, I had orchestrated subtle misalignments between factions. Alliances began to fracture without a single threat of violence. Fleet commanders who had prided themselves on strategy now second-guessed orders. The smallest suggestion of uncertainty from a human mind had forced recalculation across the galaxy's most powerful systems. Even as the Council continued its debates, private communications began to shift. Delegates reached out to Earth's representatives, discreetly seeking advice, counsel, and clarification. Humans, previously invisible, previously underestimated, were now an axis of influence, quietly dictating terms through intellect alone. By the session's close, whispers echoed through the chamber. The human. They are unlike anything we've faced. They bend conversation like a weapon. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that the galaxy had underestimated humans in a way that would have consequences for centuries. Humans didn't need fleets. We didn't need energy beams. All we needed was understanding, audacity, and the ability to exploit what others assumed was our weakness. The Council would never be the same. By the seventh day, the subtle tremors I had set in motion had grown into ripples that threatened to become tidal waves. The Council was no longer a unified front of confident alien powers. Instead, it had fractured into a complex web of suspicion, hesitation, and covert negotiations. Every species was watching every other species, questioning loyalties, double-checking claims, and fearing missteps. I sat at the center of it all, calm, observing, calculating. Humans had always excelled in situations that others underestimated. While the galaxy relied on overwhelming firepower and intimidation, we relied on observation, strategy, and the audacity to act where no one expected. Today, my plan expanded. I began to introduce controlled scenarios that forced multiple factions to reconsider their positions simultaneously. Suppose Faction D refuses to honor an agreement, I said, careful to let my words carry no threat. And Faction E decides to intervene. Could Faction F leverage this situation to shift the balance of trade? And what unintended consequences might arise? Heads turned. Whispers circulated. Some species consulted aides, others recalculated strategies mid-discussion. No weapons had fired, no fleets had moved, yet the galaxy was already in motion. One particularly aggressive faction, the Krath, attempted to assert dominance. Their holographic fleet projections shimmered in the Council's main display, intimidating smaller species. I observed carefully, noting their timing, the way their generals leaned forward, the subtle twitch of antennae indicating pride and fear. I responded with questions and reasoning, carefully highlighting long-term consequences, exposing vulnerabilities, and subtly suggesting alternative courses of action. Each suggestion was precise, calculated, and disarming. By the time I finished, the Krath hesitated, unsure whether to act or hold back, a rare uncertainty for a species that thrived on aggression. Even the Frazilith general, usually quick to anger, leaned back, antennae flicking in contemplation. This human, they do not wield weapons, and yet they control outcomes. That was the truth. Humans did not need fleets, not yet. We had leveraged our understanding of psychology, strategy, and communication to achieve what raw power could not. By the end of the session, factions were privately negotiating with Earth's delegates, seeking counsel, alliances, or at least reassurance. Humans had moved from invisible observers to invisible architects of galactic dynamics, and somewhere in the shadows, whispers began to form a new legend. Humans do not fight like others. They win without fighting at all. The galaxy had just begun to realize the most dangerous species wasn't the one with the largest fleet. It was the one whose mind could twist the intentions of every other species in the room. By the 8th day, the chamber no longer felt like a council room. It felt like a chessboard stretched across the galaxy, every delegate a piece, every fleet a potential move. And in the center, I was the human mind orchestrating outcomes without a single shot being fired. The aliens had begun to notice a pattern: subtle questions, gentle provocations, hints of possibility that left them second-guessing themselves. Factions that had once approached the council with arrogance now double-checked every plan, weighed every alliance, and reconsidered every threat. Humans had transformed uncertainty into a weapon more potent than any energy cannon. I began deploying controlled chaos. I presented hypothetical scenarios in rapid succession, each carefully designed to touch multiple factions at once. If Faction G moves to claim the Zarion system while Faction H negotiates resources in the Nivax sector, what unintended consequences could emerge for Faction 1? I asked aloud. Whispers erupted. Delegates leaned toward aides, frantic calculations underway. Fleet projections were recalculated, holograms adjusted mid-simulation. Some factions even paused ongoing maneuvers in real space just to reconsider their positions. One particularly aggressive alien, a towering Kraith warlord, banged a claw against the council floor, sparks flying from the surface. "This human! They manipulate the entire council with words!" I smiled inwardly. They didn't yet understand the full scope of what humans could do. Words were not just words. They were tools, instruments of strategy, and weapons of influence. And unlike weapons, they left no visible damage, only results. As the session progressed, smaller factions quietly began to realign their loyalties. Secret meetings were requested, private channels opened, and confidential treaties drafted, all influenced by human reasoning. I had not forced, threatened, or commanded a single delegate, yet the galaxy was bending to our logic. Even the Frazilith general, normally unshakable, adjusted its stance, antennae flicking nervously. For the first time, it had to calculate not just brute force, but the implications of human unpredictability. By the end of the day, whispers became discussions. Earth's human. They do not need fleets. They do not need weapons. And yet, they control outcomes across the galaxy. And I knew that this was only the beginning. Humans had discovered a principle the galaxy would never forget. True power does not always come from firepower. It comes from foresight, adaptability, and audacity. By the 9th day, humans were no longer subtle observers. We were architects of the council's flow. Every faction, from the aggressive Krath to the stoic Thrill, now recognized a simple truth: underestimate humans at your peril. I had begun steering discussions toward decisions that subtly favored cooperation, compromise, and long-term stability, without anyone noticing that the guidance came from a single human mind. "Consider the Helix corridor," I said, eyes scanning the chamber. "If we allow free trade under oversight instead of claiming exclusive control, multiple factions can gain resources simultaneously. The risk of conflict decreases, and all parties retain leverage for future negotiations." There was a pause. Every delegate processed the implications. Some whispered to aides, others exchanged hesitant glances with rivals. A minor faction, previously ignored, even spoke up cautiously, proposing a compromise they would have rejected just days before. It was the first overt HFY moment. Humans, small and underestimated, reshaping galactic politics through intellect alone. No fleets had moved, no battles had been fought, yet control had shifted unmistakably. The Frazilith general's massive claws tapped nervously. "How can one species wield such influence without deploying a single ship?" it growled. The question, rhetorical in tone, carried a hint of fear. I smiled slightly, letting the pause linger. Humans excel in turning expectation into advantage. Our unpredictability, paired with relentless observation, created leverage no other species could anticipate. By the end of the day, private channels buzzed with requests for counsel. Factions sought guidance, alliances were reconsidered, and the once chaotic chamber began moving in a direction subtly guided by humans. Even the most powerful warlords began to whisper among themselves, "These humans." They are dangerous, not because of weapons, but because they cannot be predicted, and their logic bends outcomes like a weapon. And as I left the chamber, I knew the next phase was coming. Humans had proven we could influence the council. Next, we would shape it. By the 10th day, the chamber had changed in ways no one had expected. Alien delegates arrived with caution, scanning one another, calculating their words, and most of all, watching the human translator. Humans had moved beyond subtle influence. We were now subtly commanding the flow of decisions without issuing orders, deploying fleets, or raising weapons. I began directing negotiations with carefully phrased hypotheticals, highlighting consequences, and exposing flaws in logic. If Faction J refuses the proposed trade agreement, I suggested, Faction K could exploit supply gaps, but would risk alienating allies. Could the benefits outweigh the risks? Heads turned, whispers spread. Delegates huddled with aides, recalculating alliances mid-session. The thrill, normally patient and analytical, tilted in their levitation field, facets rotating rapidly as if processing faster than the eye could see. The Krath, aggressive by nature, now hesitated to speak first, a subtle yet unmistakable shift. Even the Frazilith general's claws tapped rhythmically against the floor, antennae twitching in frustration. This human, they are not just clever. They manipulate consequences across multiple factions simultaneously. I allowed a slight pause, letting my words sink, allowing doubt to settle like sediment in the minds of everyone present. Humans understood a principle that alien commanders had overlooked. Influence is not about control. It is about creating circumstances in which others willingly follow your reasoning. I began weaving longer, more complex scenarios, each designed to force factions to reconsider their positions, question alliances, and negotiate cautiously. Factions that had been belligerent now paused, weighing outcomes instead of acting impulsively. The chamber was no longer a battlefield. It was a carefully balanced ecosystem of thought, and humans had become the keystone species. By midday, private channels were flooded with requests for advice. Delegates who had once dismissed Earth's representatives now sought our counsel. Every suggestion we provided subtly reshaped decisions in ways that maximized long-term advantage while minimizing risk. For the first time, I realized humans were not just influencing the council. They were controlling it indirectly. Without firing a single weapon, without threatening fleets, we had established the foundation of a power structure others could not anticipate. The galaxy would never again underestimate the human mind. And as the session adjourned, the murmur in the hall was unanimous. They do not fight like us. They win without fighting at all. By the 11th day, the Galactic Council no longer treated humans as minor observers. Every species, from the smallest rim faction to the mightiest warlords, understood a chilling truth. Humans were not just clever, they were dangerous in ways they could not predict. I had begun leveraging patterns across multiple factions simultaneously. Small inconsistencies, previously unnoticed rivalries, and hidden dependencies became tools. I introduced subtle scenarios that forced factions to reassess loyalties, resource allocations, and strategic positioning, all without issuing a single command or raising a weapon. Faction L's projected expansion into the Nivara sector could trigger retaliation from Faction M, I said, voice calm but deliberate. Yet, if Faction N anticipates this, they may benefit disproportionately. Who truly controls the outcome? The chamber froze. Delegates leaned forward, antennae twitched, psychic fields pulsed in uncertainty. Even the Krath, aggressive and calculating, paused, recognizing that every action now had layers they could not fully predict. Private communications multiplied. Alliances that had been brittle shifted subtly, some factions seeking informal counsel with Earth's representatives. The power of human reasoning became evident. Uncertainty could be weaponized, doubt could be engineered, and foresight could dominate brute strength. The Fragilith general slammed a claw against the floor, sparks dancing across the surface. This human, they are rewriting the rules. Without fleets, without weapons. How? I allowed a pause, letting the weight of the statement settle over the chamber. Humans thrived in chaos, not by creating it blindly, but by structuring it, reading every motion, every micro-expression, every decision thread, and threading outcomes to our advantage. By the session's end, whispers ran like currents through the council. Earth's human. They do not fight like others. They do not strike, yet everything moves because of them. And in that realization, the galaxy began to shift. Humans had claimed a seat of power not through force, not through intimidation, but through ingenuity, observation, and the audacity to act where no one expected. The moment had come. The human advantage was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, undeniable, and unstoppable. By the 12th day, humans were no longer behind the scenes. We had become the axis around which the entire council now rotated, not by fleets, not by weapons, but by the precision of thought and strategy. Every faction, from the smallest negotiators to the most colossal warlords, now recognized that one human mind could tilt the balance of power. I began orchestrating discussions with deliberate clarity, framing problems and solutions so that each alien faction saw their own advantage in alignment with broader unseen consequences. If Faction P secures the Zarion corridor, I explained, it may provoke tension with Faction Q. But a coordinated agreement could expand trade, strengthen alliances, and reduce conflict without any loss of face. Murmurs spread, whispers turned into debate, and delegates who had once relied solely on intimidation now recalculated, adjusting fleet positions and diplomatic stances. Even the aggressive Krath, previously confident in dominance, began questioning their every move. The Fragilith general, once a figure of unwavering authority, leaned back, antennae twitching, claws tapping thoughtfully. How does one human bend outcomes across dozens of species without a single shot fired? I smiled inwardly. Humans are unpredictable, adaptable, and relentless. We read micro-expressions, trace motivations, and exploit what others assume is weakness. We don't need weapons when our minds are sharper than fleets, faster than warships, and more calculating than entire empires. By the afternoon, informal alliances had shifted. Fragile truces formed, and minor factions that had been overlooked were now being courted for influence, all directed subtly by human reasoning. The council was no longer a place of intimidation. It had become a game of strategy, orchestrated by an invisible human hand. The moment of clarity arrived when whispers became consensus. Humans were not merely participants. They were controllers of circumstance, architects of negotiation, and arbiters of consequence. For the first time, the galaxy saw the truth. The most dangerous species is not the one with the largest fleets or the deadliest weapons. It is the one whose mind can reshape the outcome of every decision in a room full of predators. And as the session adjourned, a single thought resonated across the chamber. Earth's humans, underestimated for centuries, now unrivaled in strategy, audacity, and influence. The stage was set. Humanity had proven that negotiation, guided by cunning, observation, and audacity, could be more powerful than any weapon. The chamber was silent as the final session drew to a close. Hundreds of the galaxy's most powerful species had sat through days of debate, strategy, and negotiation, and yet none had realized that the real force in the room had never wielded a weapon. Humans had quietly rewritten the rules of engagement. I stood, translator pod at my side, aware that every eye, every psychic sensor, antenna, and ocular stalk was on me, not with fear, not with aggression, but with respect and awe. The galaxy had witnessed something new, a species that could bend entire empires without firing a shot. The Fragilith general, who had once thumped the floor with authority and rage, now lowered its massive claws in acknowledgement. Perhaps Humans are not weak, it murmured, antennae flicking in contemplation. Perhaps we miscalculated. Whispers flowed through the chamber. They do not fight like us. They win without fighting. Their minds, their audacity, the truth could not be denied. Humanity's underestimated strength was now evident, woven into every discussion, every decision, and every strategy across the council. I looked around at the alien delegates recalculating alliances, reconsidering power, and quietly seeking guidance. Humans had achieved what fleets could not, what weapons could not, and what intimidation had failed to accomplish. We had proven that intelligence, foresight, and audacity are the deadliest forces in the universe. And as I left the chamber for the final time, one thought crystallized in my mind, echoing across every corner of the galaxy. The era of underestimating humans was over. From this moment forward, every species would measure strength not only in firepower but in cunning, observation, and the relentless audacity to survive and outthink the impossible. Humans didn't need weapons. We had something far more powerful: our minds, our courage, and the audacity to turn every challenge into an advantage. The Council would never forget the day a single human reminded the galaxy that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is one that no one expects. And that was humanity's victory. Quiet, unstoppable, and absolute.